In the early years, the internet was not a place you visited. It was a utility you accessed, a dim room of text and blinking cursors that demanded you learn its switches. Then someone built a window, a simple frame that let ordinary people see the network as a world, not a command. And once that window existed, the fight stopped being technical and started being territorial. Because the browser was never just a tool, it was the lens. Whoever controlled it could decide what loaded fast, what broke, what felt normal, and what quietly disappeared. This is the story of the browser wars, not as nostalgia for dial-up chaos, but as a blueprint for how power moves in technology. How Netscape turned the web human and accidentally created an economy. How Microsoft responded with distribution so ruthless it rewrote the meaning of choice. How the courtroom tried to catch a tidal wave and arrived late. How the web froze under a monoculture and then thawed under a rebellion built by volunteers. How Google entered with a browser that looked empty because it wanted the browser to vanish and leave only the web fast enough to become an operating system. And how we ended up in an era where you can pick from a dozen icons and still run the same engine underneath. A monoculture that updates itself quietly and sets the tempo for billions of lives. If you have ever wondered why the internet feels the way it feels, why certain standards win, why privacy is always a negotiation, and why your digital world seems to narrow even as it expands, you are already inside the story. So settle in. We are going back to the moment before the web had a face, and following the window as it becomes a weapon, a marketplace, a prison, and finally the invisible operating system you live inside every day. If you want more stories like this, stories that trace modern life back to the hidden decisions that shaped it, subscribe now. And if you are listening on a platform where you can rate or review, take a second to do it, because it is the simplest way to tell the algorithm that long-form, high-effort history still matters. And tell me in the comments which era you lived through, the Netscape days, the IE6 winter, the Firefox rebellion, or the Chrome takeover, because your memory is part of this archive. The history of the modern web splits into two eras, before the browser and after it. But that neat divide hides what it felt like to live on the wrong side of the glass. We remember the boom, the logos, the billionaires, the lawsuits, the sleek tabs, and the streaming video. We forget the friction. We forget the silence. In the early 1990s, the internet was not somewhere you went. It was something you accessed the way you accessed electricity, a utility that demanded you learn its switches. It was a dim room of text and blinking cursors, a space where knowing mattered more than wanting. You spoke in commands. You moved by typing addresses you already had, file transfer, remote login, gopher menus that felt like filing cabinets. The blunt certainty of text that arrived without color or persuasion. There were no images waiting in line inside your paragraphs. There were no fonts performing personality. There was no back button that forgave curiosity. There was only the pipe and the valve, and if you turned the wrong one, you got nothing. To understand the later violence, the corporate espionage, the trillion-dollar platforms built on top of a simple rectangle of pixels, you have to start with the piece that came before. It was a cold piece, the piece of the command line, the piece of a network that did not yet have a face. The browser wars did not begin because two companies suddenly hated each other. They began because someone finally built a window, and once you have a window, someone will try to own the frame. The first web was born out of bureaucracy, not romance. At CERN, where scientists came and went with their own machines and their own operating systems, knowledge kept getting lost in transit. Not because the information did not exist, but because it could not be stitched together into a shared memory. Tim Berners-Lee looked at that problem and treated it less like a wiring issue and more like a failure of imagination. What if documents could point to other documents with simple links? What if the network could become a library where references were alive? What if you could navigate knowledge rather than request it? In late 1990, on a NeXT computer, one of those black magnesium cubes that looked like a piece of the future dropped into an office, he wrote the first browser and the first editor in one tool. He called it WorldWideWeb, all one word, a name that sounded like a prophecy and a placeholder at the same time. It worked. It proved the concept. It also did not matter to almost anyone alive, because it only ran on that one machine and that one operating system. The web existed as a small cluster of documents at CERN, a ghost town with a single street. Outside the lab, the internet grew in other directions, in emails and file servers and academic protocols, but the web slept. The revolution was real and also invisible, like a spark trapped under glass. Then the scene shifts to Illinois in 1993, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a building that felt more like a research fortress than a startup incubator, and inside it, a group of young developers who had the time and the restlessness to treat a global network like a personal challenge. Marc Andreessen, 21, loud intelligence and relentless confidence, and Eric Bina, brilliant and quieter, looked at the web and saw not a finished thing, but a medium waiting to be human. The existing browsers were academic instruments. They felt like homework. They were functional in the way a lab bench is functional. Andreessen wanted something that felt like a magazine, something that looked like culture rather than documentation. He wanted color. He wanted layout. Most of all, he wanted pictures. That desire was heresy in the early internet culture. The purists argued that images were frivolous, that they would clog the network. The bandwidth was sacred. The internet was for data, for formulas, for text. Andreessen did not care. He and Bina began building a new browser called Mosaic. And that name mattered because it implied what the web had not yet become. A mosaic is not a single column of letters. It is pieces assembled into an image. It is variety arranged into meaning. The key move that turned the browser from a tool into a medium now looks almost childish in its simplicity. Inline images. The ability to place an image directly within the flow of text so that you did not have to step out of your reading to open a separate window and wait for a separate file. Before Mosaic, pictures were interruptions. With Mosaic, pictures became part of the sentence. Text and image together in one place on one page with the same rhythm. It collapsed a cognitive gap that people had learned to tolerate without realizing they were tolerating it. It made the web feel like it had a surface. They work the way young teams work when the thing they are making still feel like play. Long stretches without sleep, the room lit by monitors and cheap soda, and the conviction that the coolest idea always deserves to exist. Bina built the engine. Andreessen carried the vision and the conversation, answering emails from early users and absorbing their confusion and delight. On January 23, 1993, Mosaic went out into the world. It crashed. It was rough. It was alive. And then came the decision that made it contagious. They put it on the machines people actually had. Unix first, then the Mac, and then Windows, the platform that sat on desks everywhere like a beige shrine. The effect was instantaneous. It was viral before the culture had the word viral. Mosaic did not merely display the web, it created the appetite for the web. In 1993, there were only dozens of sites. Then there were hundreds. Then there were thousands. The default gray background became an aesthetic by accident, a whole era tinted by a setting. The blue underlined link became the universal symbol of motion, a tiny piece of design language that taught billions of people the same gesture. Click here means go. As more people arrived, the old guard panicked. They called it the Eternal September, a joke with teeth, a reference to the annual influx of new students into online communities who did not know the unwritten rules. But this time the influx never ended. The walls of the dark room fell and the light was messy. For Andreessen, it was victory. For the internet culture that had grown comfortable with its own narrowness, it felt like an invasion. Both were true, and the tension between openness and control would become the repeating pattern of everything that followed. In Silicon Valley, Jim Clark was searching for his next act. He had built Silicon Graphics, a hardware legend, and he could see the margins shrinking, the gravity shifting toward software. He had money, reputation, and a hunger for the future. He contacted Andreessen, met him, tried to pitch an interactive television idea, and got bluntly shut down. The web, Andreessen insisted, was the future. The window was the future. But there was a problem. The university owned Mosaic. The code, the name, the trademark. Andreessen could not simply take it. So they did something that felt aggressive and also strangely clean. They did not steal the code. They stole the brainpower. They recruited the Mosaic team out of Illinois, moved them to California, set them up in a plain office in Mountain View, and told them to rewrite the browser from scratch. If the university owned the past, they would build a new future that happened to look very similar, but was legally distinct. It was a founding gesture that revealed what the browser was about to become. Not a public good, not a research artifact, but a weapon whose ownership mattered. They needed a name that implied navigation and scale. They started with Mosaic Communications, then under legal pressure, changed it. Netscape. The code name inside the company was even more direct. Mozilla, a monster name that meant mosaic killer, a joke and a mission in one. They wanted to crush the thing they had created and replace it with something faster and more commercial. In October 1994, Netscape released the first beta of Navigator. It was free for individuals and paid for corporations, a model that looked sensible in the old software world. It was polished, quick, and psychologically clever. Images loaded progressively, resolving in front of your eyes so that a slow modem felt less slow. The adoption curve was not a slope, it was a wall. Netscape did not gain market share so much as it became the market. By early 1995, most web traffic ran through it. For a brief moment, the browser belonged to the pirates, the fast-moving startup that treated the future like a sprint. Up in Redmond, Microsoft sat at the peak of its power and still missed the point. Windows 95 was coming. The personal computer was the center of the universe, and Microsoft owned the center. Their attention was on proprietary visions of an information superhighway, controlled networks, the kind of future where the gatekeeper would be rewarded for building the gate. The web looked like a curiosity, a messy academic project. Inside Microsoft, a smaller group of anxious employees could see the shape of the threat. Netscape was not just an application. It was a platform. If developers built for Netscape, they might not need Windows. The browser could turn the operating system into a commodity, a set of device drivers, a layer you barely noticed. And for a company that made its fortune by being noticed, that was existential. The first browser war did not begin with a battle of features. It began with a date that rewired the psychology of technology and finance. August 9, 1995. The Netscape initial public offering. A company barely old enough to walk, unprofitable, went public and detonated on Wall Street. The stock price opened at a figure that made no sense to traditional valuation and closed at a figure that made even less sense. And by the end of the day, Netscape was worth billions. The world got a new phrase, the Netscape Moment, which meant the internet had become an economy. It minted early internet billionaires and taught investors that a browser could be more than software. It could be leverage. Inside Netscape, the mood was euphoria, and euphoria is where mistakes breed. They assumed the war would be won by innovation, by building the better browser, by moving faster. They forgot a rule that capitalism teaches again and again. The best product often loses to the best distribution. And Microsoft had the greatest distribution machine ever built, welded to every new computer sold. Before the IPO fireworks had cooled, Bill Gates sent a memo that would become legendary, not because it was poetic, but because it was panic-made articulate. May 26, 1995, the Internet Tidal Wave Memo. Gates admitted the shift he had resisted. The Internet was not a side feature. It was changing the rules. It was an opportunity and a threat. The browser was becoming the platform, and that could not be allowed to happen outside Microsoft control. The order went out. Microsoft would become an internet company, and Netscape had to be neutralized. Microsoft had a practical problem. They did not have a browser worth shipping. Building one from scratch would take too long. Netscape was iterating quickly, while Microsoft moved on operating system timescales measured in years. So Microsoft did what powerful incumbents do when a new entrant has speed. They bought a shortcut. They licensed code from Spyglass Mosaic, a commercial descendant of the original Mosaic Andreessen had built and left behind. The irony is almost perfect. The two main weapons of the First War shared DNA. The conflict was a family feud over the same kingdom. The first Internet Explorer arrived tied to Windows 95 in a way that made it look like an accessory. It was not good. It was slow, buggy, missing features. Netscape mocked it, and the press agreed. But quality was never the point. The point was presence. The point was the icon, the blue letter on the desktop, sitting inches from your hand every day, waiting for habit to form. Then Microsoft executed the move that turned a product contest into asymmetrical warfare. They made Internet Explorer free, not discounted, not trialware, free forever for everyone. Netscape could not match that without starving. Netscape needed browser revenue to survive. Microsoft could lose money on the browser indefinitely as long as it protected Windows. This was not competition. This was scorched-earth economics. Internally, the intent was described in language that sounded like siege warfare, cutting off air supply, starving the opponent. The masterstroke was bundling, not merely offering IE with Windows, but entangling it with the operating system so that removing it would break the system. The browser became a feature by legal definition and an unavoidable default by practical reality. Suddenly, the battle was not about convincing users to choose. It was about ensuring users never had to choose at all. Between 1996 and 1997, the web developed a fever. Netscape rushed to add features, not always because users demanded them, but because the company needed to stay ahead. Proprietary tags, visual tricks, layout experiments, anything that could make the web feel like it belonged to Navigator. They were trying to run faster than the giant behind them. Microsoft responded with money and manpower, pouring hundreds of millions into the browser team, growing it from a small group into 1,000 people, turning the browser into a corporate priority with a war room mentality. Internet Explorer 3 was the turning point, the first version that felt legitimately modern. It supported emerging standards, and it ran with the confidence of a product that knew it had distribution on its side. The web began to fracture. Developers had to build two versions of everything. Best viewed in this browser, best viewed in that browser, a humiliating phrase that sounded like a joke and worked like a warning. Cross-browser compatibility became a daily nightmare. The web was no longer one medium. It was a battlefield of interpretation, where the same page could look different depending on which army you stood with. While engineers fought in code, executives fought over channels. Netscape tried to partner with internet service providers and PC manufacturers to get pre-installation. Microsoft used leverage that only a monopoly has. Manufacturers needed Windows licenses to sell computers. Microsoft could make demands. Put the Explorer icon on the desktop. Do not promote Netscape. Do not make the choice obvious. Do not place the rival where a user might notice it. These were golden handcuffs. Even if a user wanted Netscape, the user had to actively seek it, download it over slow connections, install it, and then resist the gravitational pull of the default. By late 1997, the tide turned. Netscape market share began to slide from dominance into decline, and the decline had a particular cruelty. It was not caused by a sudden loss of competence. It was caused by a new reality where browser revenue could not exist because the price had been set to zero by a company that did not need the revenue. Netscape was not losing a race. It was being suffocated by an opponent willing to burn the field. The corporate theater of the war peaked with Internet Explorer 4. Microsoft launched it with Spectacle, a giant emblem in San Francisco. The kind of public celebration that only makes sense if you see software as empire. Then a symbol appeared on Netscape lawn, a huge metal letter dumped like a trophy and a threat. Netscape employees responded with a gesture of defiance, knocking it over and placing their own mascot on top as if humor could deny momentum. But momentum does not care about mascots. Explorer was integrated deeply into Windows. It was everywhere. Netscape was bloating under featureitis, its codebase swelling into tangled complexity, and the Navigator metaphor began to feel ironic. The ship was taking on water. By 1998, the war moved from server rooms to courtrooms. The United States Department of Justice and a coalition of states filed an antitrust case against Microsoft. The accusation was simple in wording and enormous in implication. Microsoft was using its operating system monopoly to destroy competition in browsers by bundling and by making removal impractical. The trial turned internal emails into public exhibits. The language of conquest became courtroom evidence. The case put Bill Gates under a spotlight that revealed something many users never saw. Not the genial technologist, but the combative executive, arguing over definitions, insisting that the browser was not a product but a feature. That integration was necessary. The choice was an illusion because the system needed the code. But trials move at a different speed than markets. While lawyers argued, the default kept winning. Netscape was dying, and in dying it reached for an idea that sounded almost spiritual. January 22, 1998, Netscape announced it would release the source code of its next-generation browser to the public. It would open the engine to the world. Mozilla would become not just a code name, but a real project, an appeal to the wisdom of crowds, to the belief that thousands of volunteer developers could rebuild what a startup could no longer sustain. It was one of the most radical choices a major software company had made, and it carried a kind of moral charge. It suggested that the web should not be owned, that the browser should be a commons. In the short term, it was chaos. The code was messy, full of legacy decisions and proprietary tangles. The open source community looked at it and recoiled. And then Mozilla made the decision that software engineers dread and executives romanticize. They chose to rewrite. Instead of fixing the old code, they would throw it away and build a new engine from scratch. It was noble and also disastrous. Rewrites take time, and time was exactly what the Netscape did not have. The business side sought an exit. In late 1998, America Online acquired Netscape, a transaction that made founders wealthy and marked a cultural end. AOL was a walled garden, built for mass market users who did not want the raw web. They wanted a curated experience, a service, a subscription. Browser innovation was not the priority. Subscribers were. Netscape became a division, a brand, an artifact of a battle already lost. Meanwhile, Microsoft kept shipping. Internet Explorer 5 arrived in 1999 and was, by the standards of the time, brilliant. It moved the web toward applications, toward pages that could communicate with servers without reloading, the early ingredients of the interactive services that would later define daily life. It was faster, stable, and most importantly, pre-installed. Users did not choose it. They discovered it the way fish discover water. By the turn of the millennium, the war was over and the victory looked absolute. Netscape 6 finally arrived, built on the new Mozilla Foundation, and it arrived like a tragedy on schedule. It was too slow, too buggy, too different from what the web had become under Explorer dominance. Standards compliance, which should have been a virtue, became a liability because so many sites were built around Explorer quirks. Loyal users finally gave up. Market share fell into single digits. The dream of a rival platform collapsed into nostalgia. In the antitrust case, Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson ordered Microsoft split into separate companies, operating system, and applications, a dramatic verdict that felt like justice. But justice came late and moved slowly. Appeals stalled the breakup. A settlement arrived. Microsoft avoided dismemberment. It promised constraints and shared interfaces and then continued as a unified empire. The punishment did not match the scale of the victory. The monopoly remained. By 2001, Explorer held a staggering share of the market. And with that share came a paradox. The browser generated no direct revenue. It existed to protect Windows. Once Netscape was gone, the urgency disappeared. Microsoft dissolved or scattered much of the browser team. Maintenance replaced ambition. The web entered a winter, and it is hard to overstate how deeply that winter shaped the psychology of an entire generation of users and developers. Internet Explorer 6 launched in 2001, and at first seemed competent. Then years passed. 2002, 2003, 2004, and without major updates, the software began to rot. Standards evolved without it. Layout rules diverged. Designers learned a new craft, not design, but compromise, writing hacks that deliberately broke code so that pages could appear normal in a browser that had become the default and therefore the law. For developers, the pain was constant. For users, the pain was more visceral. Pop-ups multiplied because the browser did not block them. Malware arrived through the window because the window was full of cracks. Toolbars stacked like barnacles until the content shrank into a narrow strip. The browser became not a gateway, but a vulnerability. The blue icon, once a symbol of the web, became a symbol of risk. And yet, in the ashes of Netscape, a small fire continued. Mozilla, now a non-profit steward rather than a corporate product team, struggled with its own bloated ambitions, a suite that tried to be everything at once. Two developers, Dave Hyatt and Blake Ross, went rogue with a different philosophy. Strip it down. Make it for users. Build one thing well, a browser, nothing else. A product that respected attention. The project cycled through names as trademarks collided, but the idea remained. Tabs, a simple interface choice that changed the mental model of browsing. Instead of a desktop flooded with separate windows, a single frame could hold many contexts. Pop-up blocking that made the web quiet again. A focus on speed and usability that felt like relief. When the browser finally launched as Firefox in 2004, it did not arrive with bundling. It arrived with evangelism. It spread like a resistance movement, passed from friend to friend, installed on family computers as an act of care, recommended not because of loyalty to a corporation, but because it solved daily pain. The Spread Firefox campaign revealed something the First War obscured. Distribution could be social, not just contractual. People raised money to buy a full-page newspaper ad, a public declaration that users were fed up, that choice mattered. The web gained a new symbolic image, an orange fox wrapped around a blue globe, and for a while it meant freedom from monoculture. Firefox also helped thaw the developer world. Tools emerged that let people inspect the structure of pages, debug layouts, experiment in real time. The web stopped feeling like a black box. It became a craft space again. A wave of services followed, photo sharing, social news, the early architecture of what came to be called Web 2.0. The cool web began to assume standards that Explorer 6 ignored. The phrase best viewed in Explorer started to vanish, replaced by an unspoken expectation that the web should work everywhere. By 2005, the unthinkable happened. Explorer share began to slip. Not a collapse, but a leak. The influential users, the tech-savvy, the people who recommended tools to everyone else, had left. Microsoft reassembled the browser team and promised Explorer 7 with tabs and blockers, features it had once dismissed as unnecessary. The winter was ending, but the thaw exposed something deeper. The browser was no longer just a document viewer. The browser was becoming an application platform. People were not simply reading pages, they were writing, uploading, living inside the window. This is where the story takes a turn that explains the next decade. The first browser war was won by distribution. The second would be won by performance. And the company that would dominate it was not the old monopoly or the open source rebel, but a search engine company living in a rented castle. By 2008, Google ruled the web economy through search and advertising, but its crown depended on other people's browsers. Gmail, Maps, Docs, the services that hinted at replacing desktop software, all ran inside Windows controlled by Microsoft and Mozilla. If Microsoft changed defaults, if the browser platform shifted away from Google's strengths, Google's revenue could wobble. Engineers inside Google also confronted a technical ceiling. Browsers were too slow, too fragile, too single-threaded to become the operating environment Google envisioned. If the web was going to be the platform for software, the engine needed to be rebuilt. Google launched its browser like a company that understood narrative, not with a conventional press release, but with a comic that explained the philosophy in approachable terms. The browser appeared with an interface that looked almost empty, stripped of ornament, reducing the frame so the page could dominate. The message was subtle and profound. The browser is not the product. The web is the product. The best browser disappeared. Under the hood, the real revolution was a new approach to JavaScript. The language had long been treated as a lightweight script for small effects, but Google treated it like a serious runtime, compiling it, optimizing it, turning it into an engine for applications. The speed gains were not marginal. They were shocking. The web could suddenly do things it had no right to do on the old browsers. Rich interfaces, heavy computation, applications that felt like desktop software. Performance became the new currency. Google also attacked stability with process isolation. Each tab became its own process, so a crash did not mean losing everything. The browser felt sturdier, more modern, more like an operating system itself. The cost was memory usage and battery drain, complaints that became common, and yet rarely changed behavior because speed and stability are addictive. Users will forgive a hungry machine if it makes the world feel immediate. Mozilla faced a cruel irony. Firefox had freed the web from Microsoft, but now it was trapped between the old default and the new speed king. It was not bundle. It was not the fastest. It was the middle choice, and middle choices die quietly. Mozilla fought to catch up, rewriting architecture, building multi-process support, trying to match a company that could fund a browser as a strategic weapon rather than a revenue product. Millions of power users, the same people who once evangelized Firefox, migrated to Chrome because Chrome felt like the future arriving early. Chrome accelerated another transition that changed what the web was made of. For years, rich media on the web meant plugins, and the dominant plugin was Flash, a proprietary layer that powered video players, games, animation, and also a steady stream of security nightmares. The smartphone era struck the first blow when Apple refused to allow Flash on the iPhone, forcing the industry toward open standards. Chrome finished the job by pushing the web toward native capabilities, video and animation and audio handled by the browser itself. Flash did not die in one dramatic moment. It withered as browsers paused it, blocked it, and finally treated it like a relic. The implication was enormous. The browser no longer needed external organs. The browser was becoming a full body. The most quietly powerful weapon Chrome introduced was the silent update. In the old era, browser upgrades were events, something users postponed and corporations feared because changes broke internal systems. That slowness created long tails of outdated software, years of stagnation. Chrome updated itself in the background, turning the browser into a living organism that evolved without asking permission. For developers, this changed everything. New features could roll out in weeks rather than years. Standards could advance at a pace set by the dominant engine. The web began to move again, but it moved to the rhythm of the company shipping the engine. Google also made a move that looked like generosity and functioned like strategy. The browser was proprietary, but the core engine was released as an open-source project, Chromium. Anyone could build a browser on top of it, and many did. Old competitors abandoned their own engines and adopted the Chromium core. New niche browsers emerged with different branding and different promises: privacy, productivity, minimalism. But under the skin, they shared the same code. This felt like open source winning, but it also meant consolidation at a deeper layer. If one engine becomes the default for most browsers, then the company guiding that engine guides the web. By the mid-2010s, Chrome had become the most popular browser in the world. Explorer declined. Firefox persisted, but diminished. The second browser war ended with speed and updates and the gravitational pull of a platform company that wanted the browser to be the runtime for modern life. If you want to pinpoint the moment the browser wars truly ended, not with a treaty, but with capitulation, look to December 6, 2018, when Microsoft announced it would abandon its own modern browser engine and rebuild Edge on Chromium. And this was not a small technical choice. It was a symbolic reversal. The company that once welded a browser to an operating system to maintain dominance was now adopting its rival engine because it could not win mindshare and could not convince developers to care. The market had moved. Developers optimized for the engine most users had. Users followed the browser that felt fastest and simplest. Microsoft chose survival over sovereignty. From the outside, the browser landscape now looks diverse. Many names, many icons, many marketing angles. Chrome, Edge, Opera, Vivaldi, Brave. But the diversity is mostly skin. Strip away the branding, and most of these browsers share the same rendering engine and the same JavaScript engine. The web has returned to a monoculture, but this time it is a hyperactive one. The old monoculture froze the web. The new monoculture accelerates it. The risk does not disappear, it changes shape. A bug in the dominant engine becomes a bug in most browsers. A policy decision in the dominant project becomes a pressure on everyone. Two holdouts remain with real weight. Safari, sustained by Apple's ecosystem control, especially on mobile devices, where Apple requires that browsers use its engine. And Firefox, the last major browser running an independent engine outside direct control of a trillion-dollar platform company. Firefox remains the symbolic guardian of the open web, the reminder that standards should not be dictated by one corporate codebase. But Firefox share has dwindled, and dwindling share creates a vicious circle. Developers deprioritize testing. Sites degrade quietly. Users encounter friction and leave. The open web becomes an ideal supported by fewer and fewer people, an ecosystem where independence survives by stubbornness rather than by power. At the same time, the browser completed a transformation that makes the phrase browser war feel almost quaint. The browser stopped being an app and started being the operating environment. Look at the modern desktop and you will find applications that are essentially web pages packaged as desktop icons. Chat clients, music players, even code editors running inside frameworks that embed the Chromium engine. The operating system becomes a bootloader, a hardware manager, a thin layer that exists to start the real platform. The web runtime. The window ate the desktop. This shift creates a new tension at the heart of the modern web. The company that leads the dominant browser engine is also an advertising company. The browser is the most intimate sensor you use every day. the place where searches, purchases, messages, maps, work, entertainment, and identity pass through one interface. Whoever shapes that interface shapes what can be observed, what can be blocked, what can be measured, what can be monetized. This is the privacy paradox of the modern browser era. Users want speed, compatibility, and convenience, and those desires push them toward the dominant engine. Users also want protection from surveillance and manipulation, and those desires push them away from any company whose business depends on data. The conflict shows up in battles over tracking, cookies, and extensions. When the dominant platform proposes changes that weaken ad blocking or limit extension capabilities, the backlash is immediate. But the escape routes are narrow if most alternatives share the same core. Rebellion becomes an internal modification rather than a true departure. Browsers that promise privacy while still relying on the same engine that defines most of the web. So the story ends where it began, with a window, but the window has grown so large it has become the wall itself. From the gray backgrounds of early pages to the crisp streams of video and the complex applications that run without installation, the browser evolved from a document viewer into the nervous system of the planet. We fought wars over it because whoever controls the window controls the mediation layer between human attention and digital reality. Control the frame and you control what appears normal, what appears possible, what appears inevitable. The first war taught the world that distribution can defeat innovation. The second war taught the world that performance can defeat incumbency. The era that followed teaches a quieter lesson. That choice can exist without real diversity, that many icons can still mean one engine, that openness can be shaped by whoever writes the code that everyone else adopts. The window is open, the glass looks clear, and the world inside it feels endless. But the oldest question of media never goes away. Who owns the frame, and what are they training you to see? And if you made it to the end, here is the uncomfortable truth the browser wars leave us with. The conflict never ended. It just moved layers. Netscape versus Microsoft became Microsoft versus itself. Browser versus operating system became browser as operating system. Competition in features became competition in engines, and then competition in standards, and now competition in who gets to define the defaults that quietly shape attention and identity. The web looks open because you can click anywhere. But openness is not the same thing as independence. If most roads lead through the same engine, the map is not as free as it appears. So the next time you open a tab, remember what it really is. Not just a page, a contract, a set of assumptions about what you are allowed to run, what you are allowed to block, what you are allowed to know, and who is allowed to watch. If you want the next episode, I am already working on it. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Share this with someone who still thinks the browser is just an app, because it is not. And if you want to go deeper, check the description for the full playlist of long-form tech history. The stories of the invisible systems that made the modern world feel inevitable. Until next time, keep the window open, but never stop asking, who is framing the view?